Prophetic Sisterhood. Liberal Women Ministers of the Frontier, 1880 to 1930. Written by Cynthia Grant Tucker. This is a story almost lost. A story of free religion paid for by the dreams and visions, by the love and dedication of a score of women ministers on the western frontier of liberal religion. The author of this history, Cynthia Tucker, writes that while it might be tempting to think of this early emergence of female clergy as part of the same rising tide that has carried women into our pulpits right up to the present day. In reality, Tucker says, that historical era was a sparse and vulnerable event. Imagine these women facing that bold and frightening wilderness of Western expansion, mostly without male companions. Few of those New England patriarchs of Unitarian ministry were interested in taking on the grueling, low-paying job of organizing and tending new churches in the West. And so for a moment, after the Civil War, a critical shortage of men opened the door for women to enter the frontier, not only as liberal ministers, but as doctors, lawyers, dentists. Settlers scratching out their new lives in the West were more radical and open, Tucker tells us, not as prejudiced or bound up in the old ways of doing things, more ready to accept a woman in the pulpit. This is a story which reminds us just how easily our past can be lost. And I think that's a very important story for our time. In the end, our denomination turned its back on the frontier sisterhood. By the end of World War I, quote, not even a woman with outstanding qualifications could get the backing she needed from Boston to keep her in the ministry. They were forgotten. Tucker reports that although they fought hard against being silenced and shoved aside, the women in this biography ended up in almost total obscurity. In fact, it was only by chance that their story began to resurface in 1973, when one of the minister's memoirs turned up in an archive in Memphis, Tennessee, 600 miles and a century downriver from where it all began. And where it all began was Hamilton, Illinois, on a farm in the 1850s, not far from the bank of the Mississippi River. As a child, Mary Safford entertained her family by preaching to them from a tree stump pulpit. Her young ministerial aspirations were her parents' fault, especially her father, Stephen, who used to pepper Mary with radical ideas, Darwinism, abolition, the errors of the Bible. He was always getting in trouble, getting called before his Presbyterian church board. He died when Mary was 9, leaving her a lot of reading materials. And Mom took over raising 6 children while single-handedly running the farm. Her mom, who was quite opposite from her dad, thought that Mary would outgrow those silly games and take up her proper place as a woman in the kitchen and on the church pew. But Mother Louisa's own example as a strong, independent, and successful businesswoman spoke louder than her words. Let's hear what happened to Mary Safford.
A consummate organizer and brilliant fundraiser, Mary Safford was recognized as the driving force behind the network of women who dominated the liberal ministry of the frontier in the late 19th century. In addition to pastoring churches in Humboldt, Sioux City, and Des Moines, with Eleanor Gordon, Marie Jenny, and Helen Wilson assisting, Safford organized 7 more and made them self-supporting so as to be independent of Eastern patronage. In the 1890s, her lifelong pursuit of equal rights led to a 2-year pulpit exchange with the suffragette Reverend Gertrude von Petzold of England. On her return, Mary retired from the parish ministry, moved to Orlando, and took on the leadership of the suffrage campaigns in Iowa and Florida.
Thank you, Ann. Harvard Square Library says there was a joke going around in the 1890s in Iowa Unitarian circles. What do Catholics and Unitarians have in common? The answer was they both worship the Virgin Mary. Reverend Safford was the reason for that joke. Mary ministered in Sioux City for 14 years, from 1885 to 99. She was their first minister, and the church had more than 300 members. The population of Sioux City had doubled in 5 years from 7,500 to 16,000. By the late 1880s, Iowa was changing. The rugged pioneer life was disappearing. Iowa was prosperous. Mary's best friend and neighbor, Eleanor Gordon, also contributed to Mary's liberal thought. As children, they loved to gather around Eleanor's house, where her Uncle William was a radical Unitarian, while her Aunt Carolyn labeled herself a Channing Unitarian. Her mother's family were all Baptists, her Uncle James a spiritualist, and the house was full of religious literature and constant debating. I believe there's someone here to tell us about Eleanor.
Eleanor Gordon, a farmer's daughter from Hamilton, Illinois, spent most of her life fulfilling an early pledge that she and her best friend, Mary Safford, had made to work as a team for enlightened religion. Though she started out teaching and let Safford preach, Gordon soon saw the greater need for good pastors, and in 1889 was ordained as Safford's associate minister to the Unitarian Church of Sioux City, Iowa. Gordon moved off to serve pastorates independently for a while, but shortly after the turn of the century, when Safford suffered a nervous collapse, she returned to her friend and filled in for her at the church in Des Moines in the early 1900s. Gordon also joined forces with sister clergy in leading the state's women's suffrage campaign. Her greatest calling, however, remained the church ministry, and in 1912 she returned to a full-time pastorate with the newly formed church in Orlando, Florida, where Safford and other old Unitarian friends had gone to retire.
Thank you, Tina. We've already learned that this prophetic sisterhood was not a large wave of feminist clergy breaking down barriers. In fact, this book is a story of 20 women ministers. But in 1870, only 5 women had sought to join 600 men in the liberal clergy. 20 years later, by 1890, there were 70 women out of more than 100,000 Protestant clergy. About 48 of those 70 were Unitarian or Universalist. From 1906, when Rowena Morse was ordained, until 1917, a period of 11 years, not one other female was brought into the Unitarian ministry. The ratio was going backwards. Today, there are more than 31,500 ministers in the U.S. 29% of them are female. In 2014, 34% of all seminary students were female. The share of women in the American clergy has doubled and sometimes tripled in the past 2 decades. Guess who leads the list? Unitarian Universalists have the highest percentage of women in the ministry at 60% in 2018. What were they? We do have some things to be proud of. What were they up against, these women ministers of 1880? Few of them had formal college education. They were mostly homeschooled, but not because they chose to be or wanted to be. Harvard Divinity School at that time excluded women, even though they had as many faculty as students, which was 20. Today at Harvard, the women outnumber the men. Marian Murdoch became the first woman to complete the Bachelor of Divinity from Meadville, which is one of our UU seminaries. Is there a Murdoch in the house?
Okay, Marian E. Murdoch, born in 1850, lived to 1943. I think that made her 94 years old, or 93 years old. Raised by parents who fostered their daughter's expectations of equal opportunities, Marian Murdoch announced her intention of being a preacher when she was a girl, and raised her goal after earning a Bachelor of Divinity from Meadville Theological School. Called to be pastor in Humboldt, Iowa in 1885, Murdoch succeeded Mary Safford, who, along with Eleanor Gordon, helped ordain her. Though Marian brought in her sister Amelia to be her assistant, the work in the frontier parish proved too much and damaged Marian's health, forcing her to look for a less demanding position elsewhere. In 1890, she moved to the church in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to help Carolyn Bartlett, and there she met Florence Buck, the woman with whom she spent the rest of her life as domestic companion, co-pastor, and sister suffragist. In 1912, still in unstable health and semi-retired, Murdoch accompanied Buck to Boston and remained there until 1929, 4 years after her companion's death. She then went to live with her sister Amelia in California.
You hear the code language in there? There's a bit of code language. Thank you, Carol. In the 20 years following Mary Safford's ordination in 1880, she and her sisters had founded no fewer than 15 churches, most of them in brand new buildings paid for with locally raised money. They ran the Western Unitarian Conference and its monthly publication. In their financially independent Iowa district alone, Mary and Eleanor trained or placed more than a dozen women in the ministry. Why could these women succeed where men could not? Their ministry, first of all, like their lifestyle, was so much different. The frontier job was not a one-day pulpit presence. It was a 7-day relationship. Almost half the women were so devoted to the ministry that they refused to marry. These female ministers integrated church and home and school into one unit, which out west proved to be essential. The People's Church in Kalamazoo, in fact, after 2 years, was holding over 30 meetings and programs per week, gay, per week in their church. Out west, the church was family, and religion was communal, not individualized. They also understood the female side of God and faith. God for them was defined as, quote, the binding force that held them together and made their relationships possible. What did they accomplish in their 20-year ministry? They nurtured the primary role of pastor as teacher. They invented our form of lay ministry. Those ministers were often on the road, like the Reverend Ida Hulton, who drove her horse as much as 40 miles a day to fill 3 or 4 pulpits a week in Michigan. Church members were organized to fill in for the worship services when she was away. Kindergartens were begun with regular training for the parents in the newest theories of child development. Sunday school became a learning ground of dialogue instead of memorizing catechisms. Adult religious education became popular as they introduced the female element to the studies. They included female authors and perspectives on the arts and religion. Women were invited as guest speakers. Gender equity and social relations topics were addressed in mixed company. Men came back into the congregations. And one of their most important contributions was the rise of the social gospel as a function of the church. This message wasn't getting through in Eastern circles. Let's hear about the experience of one more sister minister, Celia Parker Woolley. Oh, well, Mary Safford. And who's number 2? Her friend? Gordon. That's right. 3 is Murdoch, Marion Murdoch. And 4 is Celia Parker Woolley.
Celia Parker Woolley, 1848 to 1918. Celia Woolley's feminist views and leadership in the Western Conference brought her into the network of women ministers on the frontier well in advance of her own ordination in 1894. Indeed, with Adele Bush, and Mary Safford, she became one of an inner circle that playfully spoke of themselves as the Super Six. As a wife and mother whose children were nearly grown by the time she took her first parishes in and around Chicago, Woolley experienced far less conflict in trying to care for both family and church than she did in trying to preach the social gospel to people who paid no attention. Unwilling to compromise what she believed, she left her church work after just 4 years, and in 1904 formed a new ministry far away from the privileged parishes to promote better race relations and serve the disadvantaged. She set up a neighborhood house called the Frederick Douglass Center, moved in with her husband, and lived there until her death.
Formed a commune to help folks in need. How about that? So you hear already in that reading a little bit of, she came in late to the ministry and there's already a turn beginning. These 20 women were as radical as any of us today. They ministered to hundreds in their congregations. And yet, by World War I, there was little evidence of the Western churches ever being women's territory. What happened to their ministry? 1, they were shunned by Boston. Always there existed this great chasm between the East and the West. The Eastern spirit was centralized authority. The Western spirit was independence and autonomy. They were more humanist, more activist. You know, don't we find here in the South how powerfully geography and culture can define us spiritually? Even in our UU churches, we are defined by the culture in which we live. 2, the Depression of 1893 brought retrenchment. The American Unitarian Association was tightening its belt. 2/3 of the association's churches were in New England. The 60 societies within 10 miles of Boston produced half the income. Guess where they were spending it? Not out west. 3, by the 1890s, in the modernizing West, resistance to the female minister began to grow. Competition expanded into the frontier. Over-churching became a common problem. You've heard church on every street corner. This was beginning to happen out there. Religion, in a sense, was becoming more liberal in all of the mainline Protestant religions, and therefore we lost some of our uniqueness as Unitarian. By the 1900s, Unitarian expansion had shifted focus to urban and university centers. They also launched an all-out effort for a manlier ministry, quote unquote. Men were dropping out at the rate of about 15 a year. Harvard enrollment was scandalously low. The Unitarian denomination had lost its status and luster and political clout. The pews were filling up with women. Oh my. As the last straw, the association voted officially in 1911 anti-women suffrage. It became unpopular to preach reform, and lifelong women ministers began to exit into other fields. And so this first women's venture into liberal ministry disappeared as quickly as it came. And we almost lost this wonderful lesson in history. The author Cynthia Tucker says, this study illuminates the mixed blessings of standing outside the establishment. These women were both influential and impotent, conspicuous and invisible. Or maybe men are really just that blind and ignorant. But history teaches us that what we think we know and experience in our lives isn't really accurate and true unless we see it deeply, connected in its roots and branching out through all of life. All truth is relative to time and place. All language is symbol. See the far horizon. Carolyn Bartlett Crane, who is a fifth picture up here, that's her right there, one of our 20 frontier ministers. Her first church was All Souls Unitarian in Sioux Falls. I close with a story told by Tucker. Carolyn remembered standing alone as a child on the deck of her father's small passenger steamboat. He taught her how to navigate the Mississippi River at a young age. She said she noticed a dramatic forest landscape on the far horizon ahead. She noticed how it flattened out as they approached and passed, and then became a commonplace shoreline. But in this stroke of wizardry, that shoreline once again regained its majesty as it receded into the distance behind. This young girl suddenly understood the deceptive nature of the distinctions we often make between our tomorrows, todays, and yesterdays. She said, don't ever think that you can see the shape of the present until it becomes a part of the longer view. Amen.